All right, let me begin with a story from Honduras. My son's here with me tonight, and he'll recognize this story. In fact, he'll even recognize the character that I'm talking about. We had a journeyman school teacher, and she just sought to immerse herself when she first came, and she stayed with a Honduran woman. She was learning the language. She was just really going at it full guns. And she was riding in the back of the car with us one time when we were going from where we lived down in the south up to the capital of Tegucigalpa. And while we were on the road, and you got to kind of understand these mountain roads, some of you probably have even been on some of these curvy mountain roads with just tremendous drop-offs on one side and then a mountain on the other, and very little room to pull off the road. Well, we're driving down the road, and all of a sudden I hear her kind of chuckle in the back seat. She says, "That makes no sense at all." I said, "What is that?" She says, "That sign we just passed." I said, "Well, what did it say?" She says, "Well, it said, no deja las piedras en el camino." Now, for those of you who don't speak Spanish, I asked her, I said, "Well, do you know what that means?" She says, "Well, if my Spanish is correct, it means don't leave rocks in the road." And I said, "Well, your Spanish is spot on. That's exactly what it means." And so she says, "Well, then it makes no sense." I said, "Why does it make no sense?" She says, "Why does it say don't leave rocks in the road? Why doesn't it say don't put rocks in the road?" And I thought for a second. I said, "Well, it's very simple. It's okay to put them there. You just can't leave them there." And she says, "That makes no sense." I said, "Well, actually, it does." We're going up this mountain road. It's a curvy, windy mountain road. Very little shoulder on one side and mountain on the other. If we were to have a flat tire, or if the radiator started to overboil, and we had to pull off the road, we can't get completely off the road. She says, "Yeah, I know." I said, "Do you know what they do when they have to pull over on a mountain road like this?" She says, "No, what?" I said, "They pull over as far as they can. They get out of the car. They walk down the road to the last curve that they went around. They go to the side of the road and look for a branch, something green, a branch or a limb with leaves on it. They break it off and they get a small pile of rocks and stick it in that pile of rocks, and it serves as a warning to any motorist coming up the road. There's a car in danger around the next curve. Slow down, be careful." It's their way of having flares, or what we would say caution triangles. And in fact, us missionaries, we call them green flares. You come up the road, you see a branch in the road, you slow down because something is around the next curve. I said, "Well, now you finish putting water back in your radiator, or you fix your flat tire, what are you going to do?" She said, I don't know. I guess you just kind of take off." She said, "That's right. You just take off. And if you just take off, what are you doing?" And she sat there and her face just drops. "You're leaving your rocks in the road." That's right. But the government doesn't want you to do that. So they put signs up that says, "Don't leave rocks in the road." It's okay to use them. It's not okay to leave them. But if you don't know the culture, if you don't know the story, the signs make no sense at all. And that's kind of what I want to talk with you about tonight. Because when we begin to deal with especially socioeconomic groups that are different than ours, we run into all kinds of discussion, and they say things and they have ideas that we sit there going, "What are they thinking? What are they thinking? I don't understand this." And if you don't know the culture, if you don't know the story, you don't understand the signs. So what I have decided, what I did when I was doing this, was to kind of refer to the study as a ministry through a poverty worldview, because that was my emphasis with Mississippi River Ministry. But for our sake, we're just going to say ministry through worldview. And you've got a couple of handouts, and I'm just going to tell you what they are real quick. I didn't give you all the handouts I used because I use other ones in the second half, which we won't get to tonight. In fact, there's one that's used in this half that I didn't give you because it's 3 pages long, front and back. And I just didn't think we needed to do that. If you want a copy of this, I'll feel free to make one for you. But I'm going to show you what it is and tell you what it is. But the first one is an article that says, "In Need of a Shepherd." You see that one? Pull that one out for just a second. If you turn it over and look on the back, you'll see it is reprinted by permission. This was an article from Missions Leaders Magazine, which was a WMU publication. It was written in the fall of 2006. Now, I need to back up with you and give you a little timeline. In 2005, and I should have brought the books out tonight. I'll bring them out next time and you'll be able to see them. In 2005, Mississippi River Ministry both hosted and I got to take part of a conference called Bridges Out of Poverty. And this was where I was introduced to Ruby Payne and a lot of her information, which you'll get the next time we get together. But as they were going through the information and describing the worldview, or actually they didn't even call it worldview, they just said these are the hidden keys of the classes is what she called them. She says, she began to describe people in poverty, and I kind of thought in my head, I said, whoa, wait a minute, time out. You're describing people from Honduras. And I realized that when she was describing Americans in poverty, and by the way, she was an educator. The purpose of her work was to try to help teachers be able to communicate better to children from poverty, low-income families. But in her efforts, what she discovered was some really keen insights as to how these families operated and how they thought and how they passed it on to their children, and so what their children were thinking and why many times the teachers weren't getting through to them. And so I went to this training in 2005 and I was amazed. I came away saying, she's not just talking about American poverty, she's talking about a poverty worldview. And this poverty worldview was pretty much universal, and I've talked to other missionaries in other countries with third world type poverty, and they would say the same thing. They had the same concepts. When we get done with these 2 sessions, I hope you have a unique perspective, and that perspective needs to be basically twofold. You need to first off be able to see those in poverty the way God sees them. We don't always see them that way. You remember how I shared Wednesday night about with the feeding of the 5,000, that when Jesus got out of the boat, his disciples saw the multitude, they saw a nuisance. Jesus got out of the same boat and he saw a need. And what he said basically is what I put at the very top of this. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Jesus sees people differently. In Jeremiah chapter 22, basically what you have is Jeremiah has a prophecy for the son of Josiah. Do you remember Josiah's reforms? You remember a good King Josiah? Josiah's reforms were such that he helped Israel kind of get back on track. Well, Jeremiah also had another message, and that is, but because you're not willing to, you're going into exile. And he began to prophesy about the Babylonian captivity that was to be coming. Part of his prophecy included addressing one of the sons of Josiah. And in Jeremiah chapter 22, beginning at verse 11, it says, "For thus says the Lord concerning Shallum, son of Josiah, king of Judah. He reigned instead of Josiah his father, who went from this place. He'll not return here anymore, but he shall die in the place where they have led him captive, and shall see this land no more." He then makes this prophecy beginning at verse 13. "Woe to him who builds his house by unrighteousness, his chambers by injustice, and who uses his neighbor's service without wages, and gives him nothing for his work. Who says, I'll build myself," talking about the king, "I'll build myself a wide house with spacious chambers, cut out windows for it, paneling it with cedar, painting it with vermilion." And then he asks this question in verse 15. Shall you reign because you enclose yourself in cedar? Is that what makes you a king? Did not your father," he's referring to Josiah, "did not your father eat and drink and do justice and righteousness?" Yeah, he enjoyed the good things of being a king, but he also did justice and righteousness. Verse 15 closes by saying, "Then it was well with him." But then look at verse 16. And remember, when I'm sharing this, I'm talking about God's heart for the poor. It says there in verse 16, "He judged the cause of the poor and needy. Then it was well. Was not this knowing me, says the Lord?" For years, as both a pastor and then as a missionary, I would tell folks there's basically, two ways that we get to know the will of God for our lives. One is through prayer, and the other is through His Word. He speaks to us through His Word. We speak to Him. We get direction through prayer. And then I read this, and I said, you know what? There's another way to get to know God. In fact, there's probably several. The bottom line is, you get to know God when you put on your heart the things that are on God's heart. That's what this verse says. He judged the poor and needy, then it was well. Was not this knowing me, says the Lord? How do you get to know God? By putting on your heart the things that are on God's heart. And the more we do that, the more we get to know God. And so this is important. How we deal with the poor is important. And so this is just one of many verses that come out on this particular handout. And if you're interested, I'll be more than happy to get one made for you. I just didn't want to make it indiscriminately, especially when I was giving it to every individual. The poor in Scriptures, it talks about how the Scripture, or how the poor are talked about in the law, in the writings, which is Psalms and Job and Proverbs. It talks about the poor in the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, Zephaniah. The poor in the Gospels, and then finally the poor in the epistles, Romans, Galatians. We haven't got to this part, but yes, we have. When Paul first went up to Jerusalem, he asked those in Jerusalem what he should be doing. And you may recall, I mentioned to you then, their response was they would that we should remember the poor, the same which I also was always forward or excited about doing. That's Galatians 2:10. So we need to see those in poverty the way God sees them, but then we also need to see those in poverty the way they see themselves. We tend to look at them the way we see them, not the way God sees them or the way they see themselves. And so that's what made this particularly important. That handout I gave you, In Need of a Shepherd, I want to share a part of it with you right now. And if you look at it, you'll see that after the first scripture of Matthew 9:36, that the first paragraph is actually in italics. And what that signifies is that it isn't really something that you're reading, it's something that's been spoken. And in fact, it's in quotation marks, so kind of picture it as being spoken. And to help you out, let me speak it for you. What were you thinking? Don't you know what I had to do to get you that job? We talked about this at our last meeting. You can't just decide not to go into work after 2 weeks just because you want to have a drinking binge with your friends. You promised me you weren't going back to your old group and that you definitely weren't going to be drinking anymore. Don't you want a better life for the future? Realize that when I share this conference, it's usually with people who are working with those in poverty. And I would ask the question, how many of you have ever not necessarily had this conversation, but have thought these things? Dealing with somebody that you've worked with. And the first thing that comes out of their mouth was, what were you thinking? Because that's the first place we go to. I don't understand. What made you think that was a good idea? This particular conversation is a little bit more autobiographical than I like to admit. This was a conversation I had with my wife's sister. Now, we haven't talked a lot about her, and I may very well edit this part out of of the video because it is rather personal. But I want you to hear it. Cindy and her sister, and many of you all have met and heard Cindy's testimony. They were both adopted at very young ages. Cindy was 5, her sister was 3 at the time. Raised in the same family by good Christian parents, but they both went like dark and light. They went in 2 different directions. 2 different people came out of this. Debbie is her sister, and Debbie went on to get involved in a whole lot of stuff. And she even ran away from home. While we were on the mission field, Debbie was arrested. She was in prison when we got back. She was over at Mark Luttrell in Memphis. She ended up spending 7 years. Now that wasn't coming out on parole. She had a 7-year sentence, and she served all 7 years of it. So when the time came for her to be released, Cindy and I wanted to help see her get a good start on life. We had just come back from the field. This was 2001, more or less. I think it was probably the more of the time frame, a year after we'd been back. We wanted to help her get a good start. We went down to Section 8 housing in Trenton. We got her a place. The deposit was made. She had an apartment. We talked to a few people, and then we made a couple of purchases, and we outfitted it with some basic furniture. The apartment came with some furnishings. And then we picked her up, took her home. She actually stayed with us for about a week just so that she could reacclimate back to society. Didn't want to put her in her home by herself all right away. And even when she did go to her home, my sister stayed with her for at least a week to try to help her get acclimated. We got her involved with Christian Women's Job Corps there in Trenton. While in prison, she not only had gotten her GED, she had also gotten a cosmetology degree. She could cut hair. I went to a hairdresser in Trenton, in Humboldt, and I said, Carol, who still cuts my hair, by the way, and yes, Bonnie, I did get a haircut. And I said, Carol, Cindy's sister's getting ready to get out of prison. I want to be up front with you about that. But she has a cosmetology degree. Would you give her at least a job interview? She said, oh, absolutely. Well, she did, and she hired her. And she worked pretty well till her first paycheck. She got her first paycheck. She disappeared for 3 days. Carol called me. We didn't know where she was. And then she shows up. We said, Debbie, what happened? She says, well, oh, and I didn't tell you this part. The church we were attending at the time had a good used car dealership in it. Man we knew and trusted. We actually got her a Honda Civic. I mean, with 72 hours out of prison, she had an apartment, a job, and a car. We said, Debbie, what happened? She says, well, a friend borrowed my car and didn't bring it back. And we said, well, actually, a friend took my car, is what she said. I said, well, how'd you get back? She says, well, they finally brought it back. And so we said, well, you know, I just don't know what Carol's going to say. Well, Carol took her back, and she was very gracious about it, very forgiving. And after about a week later, she disappeared for 2 weeks. And we didn't know what to do. She finally came back. She had lost her job. And I remember Cindy and I went over to her apartment one day, and there was 2 pickup trucks loading everything she owned into 2 pickup trucks. And we said, where are you going? She said, I'm going to Jackson to live with my friends. And I had no idea what we had done wrong. At least this is the way I was feeling. What had we done wrong? And this is how I felt. This is how I felt. And I know, you know, that's not the best thing to try to own up to. But this is the way a lot of us feel. When you heard me say that, I got a question for you. What was the first thing you thought about? Who does this sound like is talking to somebody else? I did this at UT Martin. It didn't take them a nanosecond. They said, that's a parent talking to their teenager. And I said, you're absolutely right. See, one of the things that I learned was with Ruby Payne is that voice has a lot to do with the way they talk and we respond. Many times those in poverty speak in a child voice, defensive, victimized, emotional, whining, losing attitude, strongly negative. Don't pick on me. And we usually respond with a parent voice. And as a parent voice, we want to be authoritative, directive, judgmental, evaluative. You know, you shouldn't do that. Life's not fair. Get busy. Pick yourself up. We use the parent voice. Now, we'll come back at the end of this and talk about an adult voice and what that would sound like. But this is one of the things that I wanted you to see that starts out building a gap between how we communicate with people who are maybe in a different framework than we are, and we already start out with this superior-inferior relationship. Sometimes we will get them into the church and bring them in, and then we express our disappointment every time they mess up. That's funny on a couple of different levels, but the whole point is that we look at that and we laugh, but that dog's biting his own hind leg, you know? And one of the things that this video clip showed me is that if we're not careful, we'll do the same thing in the body of Christ. And not recognize that those that we are biting on are a part of our same body. Paul put it this way in Galatians chapter 5, verse 14 and 15. All the law is fulfilled in one word, even in this, you shall love thy neighbor as thyself. But if you bite and devour one another, you take heed that you be not consumed one of another. There's two things about that video. One is it's a dog biting on its own leg, it's like the body of Christ biting on itself. But did you hear the only audio in this was a woman laughing? That's the world. It's laughing at us because of the way we treat people we say are part of the family of God. And so we want to be careful. And that's why this is so important. We've been studying the book of James. This started in the 2nd chapter. Let's go back there for just a second. You remember in chapter 2 it started with, my brethren, do not hold your faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ with an attitude of personal favoritism. And then he talked about the economic differences, and this is what brought us to this study. If a man comes into your assembly with a gold ring and dressed in fine clothes, and there also comes in a poor man in dirty clothes, and you pay attention to the one who's wearing the fine clothes, you say, sit here in a good place. Or you say to the poor man, you stand over there, or sit down on my footstool. And we talked about this last week. Have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil motives? We talked about this last week. What's the evil motive? The evil motive is simply saying, I want everybody to be like me. I want to be the standard. And whether you, and how you, to the degree that you measure up, is the degree to which I can have fellowship with you. He goes on in verses 5 and 6, says, listen, my beloved brethren, did not God choose the poor of this world to be rich in faith heirs of the kingdom which he promised to those who love him. And then he makes this statement in verse 6, and I want you to see this. You've dishonored the poor man. It's not the rich who oppress you, personally drag you, or is it not the rich who oppress you? Excuse me. He says, if you're going to be upset with somebody, you probably need to be upset with the rich who oppress you, personally drag you into court. In other words, he's making distinctions in both levels. In fact, as you look at this verse 6, do you see the three people groups in it? The poor, the rich, and you. And I shared with you last week, as long as you're around, there'll always be people who have less than you. As long as you're around, there'll always be people who will have more than you. And obviously, as long as you're around, there'll always be you. And so what James is trying to tell us is that this was a problem in the early church. It's a problem in our church, and it has to do with worldview. I told you the story about Debbie so that we could come back, and in a couple of weeks when we start looking at some of these indicators of a poverty worldview, and that's actually, it's not just the poverty, it's going to be of all three. It's going to cover the poverty view, the middle class view, and the wealth view. And we'll make application as they need to be made. But as you go through and read through the rest of this, and I hope you will, I hope you'll take the time, and by the time we come to the close of this, I'll be able to finish this with you. But if you work with individuals in poverty for any length of time, you'll find yourself having this form of this conversation that I just wrote. For those of us ministering, it manifests itself in frustration, disappointment, sometimes disillusionment with the prospect of ever seeing a change in the life of the person you're trying to help. For the one being ministered to, it manifests itself in confusion, defensiveness, many times anger over a bad situation for which they are being blamed again. So frustration and confusion do not provide a healthy environment for a fruitful ministry, and that's why we're going to answer some of these questions. Let's go back for just a second, because I think it's important for you to see. When I had the training back in 2005, I made the observation as she was going through all of these, what she calls the keys to the classes. I said, what you're really talking about is worldview. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with this term. This is very much a missional term. It's one that is used by missionaries all the time. When we say worldview, basically what we're saying is worldview is the way you view the world. And the way you view the world is different than perhaps maybe the person even sitting beside you in church views the world. We have all kinds of different worldviews. We have political worldviews, and those are just as distinctive even in the same congregation. And rightfully so, many times it all depends on your political leaning. We have different theological worldviews. And this is evident by many churches that disagree about so many things theologically. But probably most important in that, and what's going to affect this study, is our socioeconomic worldview. And I want you to see that when we talk about worldviews, what makes them so important? Well, worldviews are the filters through which you process the people and events around you. Worldview is how you look at the way somebody behaves, and you make judgment calls, and that's why James says you become judges with evil motives. You see them, and because of the way you were brought up and you were raised, that just ain't right. They also serve as the prompters that direct your responses. How are you going to respond to people? According to your worldview. And I'll be giving you some examples of that as we go along. It's important for us to see that worldview becomes your filter, and it becomes pretty much the way you're going to respond, and that's why it becomes the standard by which you judge the outcome of an activity. When your worldview becomes the standard, that's what James was saying. We become judges with evil motives. Why? Because we want people to be more like us. Well, I want to start out this week by sharing with you something that I think we need to come to grips with. We're going to talk about poverty, middle class, and wealth. But I want you to know they're all three in this context, socioeconomic context, worldviews, and they're worldly views. You say, why? Because that's where we learned them from. We learned them from the world. We learned them from our parents. We learned them from our families. We learned them from our communities. We learned them from our neighborhoods. We learned them from other people. And many times what we find ourselves processing information is through a worldly view because we learned it from the world. I want to take you through something that we were led in 2005. Basically, there are three in the United States, three basic economic worldviews in the United States. I just looked this up and I got 2021 figures. There is what we call the poverty line. And the poverty line, according to the government, in 2021 says that any family of 4 who makes less than $26,500 live below the poverty line. And so as such, all I'm telling you is we've learned how to define poverty. But do you see a dollar figure for middle class? No. And you won't. If I was to ask you how much money does a middle class person make, you could come up with some figure. We don't even know what to classify wealth. Last couple political cycles, what was it? They would say anybody who made over $250,000 a year, and then it became $500,000 a year. They didn't know how to classify wealth. I told him, I said, when I worked for Mississippi River Ministry, I was proud to say I had a 6-figure salary. It's just that 2 of those figures were on the other side of the decimal point. We can't define middle class by a dollar figure. You can't define wealth by a dollar figure. We use the government's figure to try to define poverty. But you know what? That doesn't even work. Because these 3 categories, poverty, middle class, and wealth, have more to do with their worldview than what's in their bank account. You see, there's different kinds of poverty. There is generational poverty. Great-grandma, great-grandparents were poor. Grandparents were poor. Mom and dad were poor. We're poor. That's generational. If it goes back more than two generations, they call it generational poverty. But then I noticed, working with Mississippi River Ministry, that there's situational poverty. I remember going downtown Memphis and seeing a man at the homeless, it wasn't a homeless center, it's just where the homeless gathered to have a worship service in Church Park, down near the FedEx building. And we would go and we'd set up and they'd have a special church service and different churches would host. And I would watch the men and women and children who were homeless on the streets of Memphis coming and gathering there. And I noticed one time I saw not an elderly, but kind of a middle-aged African American sitting on the step, waiting for the service, reading a Newsweek magazine. And I thought to myself, this man wasn't born in poverty. This man lost his job. He lost his job, he lost his mortgage, he lost his house, he lost his family, and now he's on the street. That's called situational poverty. It happens when Goodyear closed. It happens whenever places just all of a sudden you have it and then you don't have it. Because these classes are worldviews. It doesn't matter how much money. How many times have you heard people win the lottery? And they may have been poor as dirt, win the lottery. 7 years later, they're poor as dirt again. Why? Because of their worldview, not because of the money. And they just go right through it. And so these worldviews are important. And having said that, I think it's important for us to see that worldviews differ greatly between the economic classes. And so I asked the question, this quiz came straight from Ruby Payne. The questions are hers, and the only thing I changed on it was the title that she gave to each of the sections. Because in her book it says, could you survive in poverty? Could you survive in middle class? Could you survive in wealth? And as we look at these, I think you'll see that, some of you probably have been through some of this. That's not the point. I did this at the WMU get-together in Gatlinburg one year. 80 women asked the question, gave out the quiz, asked the question, could you survive in poverty? And 5 women on the front, near the front, all raised their hands. Absolutely. Yeah. And so then we went through and we said, could you survive in middle class? And most everybody in the room raised their hand, including those 5 women. They said, yes, absolutely. Well, that didn't bother me. I've seen people that have come up from poverty into middle class in their thinking and in the way they live. But then I asked the question, could you survive in wealth? And interesting, nobody raised their hand except one of those 5 women. And she raised her hand. Now, I tend not to try to embarrass anybody, but she was sitting right there. And it took me by surprise. I just looked at her. I said, excuse me, do you honestly believe you could survive in wealth? She said, hun, I can survive in anything. And that's when I realized it was the wrong question. It's not what you can do. It's not what you've done. It's, as we would say in West Tennessee, if you had your druthers, where are you most comfortable? And that's what this is about. Could you live comfortably in poverty? Now, please don't check these off. This is not the test. I'm going to tell you what the test is in just a second. I think you'll be surprised. I know which churches and sections of town have the best rummage sales. I know where rummage sales have bag sales and when. I did this at Mid-America, and one of the professors sitting in the class raised his hand, excuse me, what's a bag sale? He had no idea. I know which grocery store garbage bins can be accessed, and that should be for thrown away food. Well, you probably do too, because that's also where they keep the empty boxes when you want to go pack books and stuff like that. You get your empty boxes from the same storage area. This is talking about people who dumpster dive for food. I know how to get someone out of jail. I know how to physically fight and defend myself physically. This takes a little explaining. I like to do this because a lot of the men in the class are sitting there going, man, I can fight. Yeah. I said, no, what this is your default position. And it comes out of the fact that in poverty, the vocabulary skills are limited. And whereas you can communicate how you feel and what you think, you try talking to somebody in a situation and you're going to hear them say, you want to take this outside? We'll settle this like men. And that's the default situation. It's not that they know how. They prefer to fight and defend themselves physically. I watched my wife's sister, not watched her fight, but watched her brag about the fights that she'd been in. I know how to get a gun even if I have a police record. I thought number 7 was interesting. I know how to keep my clothes from being stolen in a laundromat. I went to the training event and I said, I'd like to know that. And they said, why? I said, just curiosity. They said, no, it's people who, for survival purposes, know how not to lose their belongings when they go to the laundromat. I know what problems to look for in a used car. I know how to live without a checking account, without electricity and a phone, and a little bit further down, without a car. This is interesting. I know how to use a knife as scissors. Do you know why? Because one of the defining traits between those in poverty and those in middle class is tools. If they don't have the tools, they find a way to do what they need to do with what they've got. I know how to use a knife, like a pair of scissors. I can entertain a group of friends with my personality and my stories. This is important because this is their currency. When Debbie got her job, when she first didn't come back, Carol wanted to let her go. She would say to me, I just don't want to let her go she's got such a great personality. And she used the expression, everybody loves Debbie. And she could use her personality, her stories. And they served as her currency to make friends. I know what to do when I don't have the money to pay the bills, so does Tracy. Every church secretary knows what they do when they don't have the money to pay the bills. And our deacons know as well. I know how to move in half a day. I watched her do it. I know how to get and use food stamps and an electronic card for benefits. I know where the free medical clinics are. I'm very good at trading and bartering, and I can get by without a car. I watched Debbie do that too. Usually I would, in the conference, would stop here and say, okay, just a quick show of hands. How many of you feel real comfortable living like this? Usually I'd get the same response, no takers. Says, okay, let's move on. Could you live comfortably in middle class? I know how to get my children into Little League, piano lessons, soccer, etc. I know how to set a table properly. I know which stores are most likely to carry the clothing brands my family wears. My children know the best name brands in clothing. I know how to order in a nice restaurant. I know how to use a credit card, checking account, savings account, and I understand an annuity. I understand term life insurance, disability, 20/80 medical insurance policies, as well as house insurance, flood insurance, and replacement insurance. 7 is very interesting. I talk to my children about going to college. Why? Why do you talk to your children about going to college? Well, for most of us, we look at college as the way to make our lives better. We look at it as a means to a better job, a better future. When we get into the differences in worldviews, we'll find out why college isn't really on the front burner. Part of it has to do with the fact that I don't want my child to leave home. Well, I want him to leave home, but I don't want to lose him. I don't want him to get an education and leave me. And there's this personal attachment. Families are very, very important, and that's a good thing. But college isn't one of the big things on the front burner for them. I know how to get one of the best interest rates on a new car loan. I understand the difference between principal interest and escrow on a house payment. I know how to help my children with their homework, and I don't hesitate to call the school if I need additional information. I know how to decorate the house for different holidays. You'd be surprised how significant that is. Just the fact that you want to celebrate and that you're decorating for those purposes. I can tell when fall is in the air, my whole living room changes. There's a guy who lives in our community. He knows how to decorate. He's got him a hay bale. Sometimes it looks like a pumpkin. Sometimes it looks like a turkey. Sometimes it looks like a bunny. But he decorates using a hay bale. I know how to get a library card. Why? Because I use the library. Well, now a lot of even people in poverty use libraries because that's their only access to the internet. But a library card is usually, when this was done, was so that because you read and you were interested in being able to check out things. I know how to use most of the tools in the garage. There's 2 things there. I think you'll see them. It means you have tools. What else does it mean? You have a garage. That's right. I repair items in my house almost immediately when they break, or I know a repair service and call it. How many of you feel comfortable living like that? Go ahead, let me see your hands. Sure. Now turn it over. I love this side. I can read a menu. My voice even changes when I read these. I can read a menu in French, English, and another language. I know several favorite restaurants in different countries of the world. I did this for a group of missionaries one time at a World Mission Conference, and they all said, well, what's the big deal? Yeah. But look at number 3. You remember how you know how to decorate for the holidays? During the holidays, I know how to hire a decorator to identify the appropriate themes and ideas with which to decorate the house. I know who my preferred financial advisor, legal service designer, domestic employment service, and hairdresser are. What you're going to discover is that in wealth, we're not talking about well-to-do. We're not talking about upper middle class. We're not even talking about lower upper class. We're talking about the middle and upper class. My dad was well off, but he wasn't wealthy. And as such, again, I say to you, it's not about how much money is in the bank. It's about the values with which you were raised. I know who my preferred financial advisor, legal advisor, designer, domestic employment service, and hairdresser are. I have at least 2 residences that are staffed and maintained, and that's not by grandchildren. I know how to ensure confidentiality and loyalty from my domestic staff, and that's not caller ID. I have at least 2 or 3 screens. Somebody asked me the other day, what's the screen? Well, that could be anything from a secretary and then to others who keep people you don't want to see from seeing you. I fly in my own plane or the company plane. I know how to enroll my children in preferred private schools. Not just private schools, but preferred private schools. I know how to host the parties that key people attend. It should say I am on the boards of at least 2 charities. I know the hidden rules of the Junior League. I was teaching this for 5 years before I ever found out what the Junior League was. It's within a community, it's that group of benevolent women who do good deeds. And they called it the Junior League. Still have no idea what the hidden rules are. At least now I know what the Junior League is. I support and buy the work of a particular artist, and that is not Norman Rockwell calendars. I know how to read a corporate financial statement and analyze my own financial statements. All right. Quick poll. How many of you feel real comfortable living like this? No takers. Are you serious? That's interesting. Now, having gone over this, let me tell you what the quiz is. And with this, we close for tonight. Here's the quiz. You told me you're comfortable here, and you're not comfortable here. Now, this is Tennessee, and I fought the lottery, so I'm not going to use the lottery. So let's just say your rich uncle passed away. The will was read, and you are the only heir. And you have just amassed a fortune that you can't begin to spend before you die. You've changed the legacy of not only your grandchildren, but your great-grandchildren with the money that you now have in your possession. Now, who would quit living like this and start living like this? For the most part, people don't want to make the change from here to here because of the value system, because of the difference in values. So would it surprise you that people who live here don't want to move here for the same reason? You see, that should surprise us because we think everybody wants to be like us. When the truth is, their worldviews dictate their values, and their values dictate the way they see what they're doing. And how many stories have you heard of homeless people who were given a place to live and then they went right back to the streets? Our objective, and if you take anything home with you tonight, take this. Our objective is not to make other people like us, but to make them like Jesus. And we do it through what's called discipleship. We share the gospel. We bring them to a relationship to God through His Son, Jesus Christ. And then we began to show them from Scripture those things that may be detrimental and self-destructive. But we do it as a journey with them, not down to them. And we'll see this more in a couple of weeks. I hope you'll come back. I hope you'll come back. Let's pray.